Shores presents
海岸贡献。
The man who brought an end to apartheid in South Africa was set free, while communism in the Soviet Union collapsed.
Enough of blood and tears. Enough!
Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shook hands in an attempt to end bloodshed between Israel and Palestine. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and launched the mother of all battles. European countries signed an agreement that created the world's largest market. In the U.S., the worst riots in American history began after a controversial trial in Los Angeles. A bomb shook Oklahoma City and stunned America.
I think it's good for the generations here and the generations to come.
The United States and Russia agreed to the largest arms reduction in the nuclear age. And American football star O.J. Simpson faced a sensational double murder trial.
Not guilty.
For only the second time in American history, a president was impeached.
No one wants to get this matter behind us more than I do, except maybe all the rest of the American people.
And in Britain, the first successful cloning of an adult mammal would leave the world community grappling with a moral question of staggering implications for the 21st century. February 11th, 1990. South African blacks celebrated the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. His wife Winnie was by his side as he walked as a free man for the first time in 27 years. Mandela was a hero of South African blacks. His name virtually synonymous with opposition to apartheid, the South African system of racial segregation. Mandela's release is especially notable because it followed a year of great advances for South African blacks. In 1990, the government of President Willem de Klerk liberalized restrictive policies against blacks and lifted long-standing bans on the African National Congress, the largest black group opposing the white minority government. Although blacks were joyous, white police showed no mercy to those celebrating newfound freedom in the streets.
They took me out of the taxi, and then they started to beat me.
Mandela had worked for years to end such oppression by the white minority. In 1944, after earning a law degree, Mandela formed the African National Congress. Mandela ran the ANC from prison where he spent nearly half of his life. He was charged with treason in 1956 but was acquitted. In 1962, he was again in custody. And in 1964, Mandela was convicted of sabotage and conspiracy. He was given a life sentence, but it was commuted and he was released at the age of 71. Mandela surprised many when he said blacks and whites must work together in order to create a South Africa where all people can be free. In April, Mandela received a hero's welcome from 100,000 people in England's Wembley Stadium, as well as a musical tribute from an eclectic group of pop stars. The music was different, but the sentiment towards Mandela was the same when he traveled to Paris. And in New York, it was a ticker tape parade and brass bands that welcomed the freedom fighter to America. Mandela used the visit to this and other U.S. cities to try and persuade Americans to continue sanctions against South Africa. To some degree, he succeeded in America, but he faced problems at home. Mandela was unable to heal political rifts between his ANC and the Inkatha Party, a Zulu movement. As a result, the two groups carried out bloody battles throughout the year. In 1994, Nelson Mandela became the first black president of South Africa, following the first biracial election in the country's history. He and his African National Congress continued the struggle to bring racial harmony to South Africa. On January 17, 1991, the world watched a horrifying spectacle, the first war to be covered by live television. It was the bombing of Baghdad, the start of Operation Desert Storm against Iraq and Saddam Hussein. Television broadcast live pictures of Iraqi anti-aircraft guns firing at Allied warplanes that were dropping bombs on strategic targets only a few blocks away. The war's prelude began on August 2, 1990, when Hussein's forces invaded neighboring Kuwait. Iraq annexed the country because it claimed it had exceeded oil production quotas and flooded the world market, harming Iraq's economy. Iraq had long coveted the oil-rich desert kingdom, and taking it was a simple task for Saddam Hussein's army, the most powerful in the Middle East. The Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington asked the world for military help.
We have appealed to all our friends around the world, including the United States, to come to our aid and assistance. Let me say that we would like to have military assistance in order to survive.
The UN imposed embargoes and other sanctions on Iraq, aimed at forcing Iraq to withdraw. But Hussein refused. So President Bush called U.S. military reserve units into action, the first such mobilization for a foreign crisis since 1968, when American forces were sent to Vietnam.
Elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, as well as key units of the United States Air Force, are arriving today to take up defensive positions in Saudi Arabia. I took this action to assist the Saudi Arabian government in the defense of its homeland.
In Baghdad, Hussein turned 9,000 foreign workers and their families into hostages, using them as human shields against military action. They were released on October 1st, as Hussein's troops prepared for the mother of all battles. In nearby Saudi Arabia, Allied forces were also gearing up for war. Egypt, Syria, Britain, and other Western countries sent troops to join the mostly American force.
From our newborn king to see Barack.
By the end of December 1990, 467,000 Allied troops were poised at the Kuwaiti border. They faced over 500,000 Iraqi soldiers.
Hit them hard. Yes, sir. We'll kick their ass. Okay.
On January 17th, Operation Desert Storm was launched. Allied planes flew more than 110,000 combat missions using laser-guided smart bombs. Iraq responded by placing captured pilots near military targets. Iraq also launched Scud missiles at Israel, but failed to provoke the country into joining the conflict. On February 22nd, President Bush offered another ultimatum: accept all UN resolutions by February 23rd. Hussein ignored the demand. So on February 24th, the Allies launched the ground war against occupied Kuwait and Iraq. Hussein was tricked into thinking the Allies would attack from the south and east. But Allied Commander Norman Schwarzkopf moved most of his attack forces from the west.
Because you have avoided a frontal confrontation with them, are you going around or over, and is that why there's little opposition?
We're going to go around, over, through, on top, underneath.
Iraqi troops fled, but managed to set fire to 500 Kuwaiti oil wells. They were easily driven out of Kuwait City and north to the border. 10,000 were caught in a huge traffic jam leaving the city and were killed when they couldn't escape the Allied air onslaught.
All right. You're all right.
Within the first 2 days, 30,000 Iraqis surrendered. On February 27th, 100 hours after it began, President Bush ordered a ceasefire to Desert Storm. 110,000 Iraqi soldiers and thousands of Kuwaiti civilians died during the war. Only 340 Allied combat deaths were recorded, 148 of them American. While the war was a stunning military victory, the political results were less clear. At the end of the year, the Iraqi military was still strong enough to quash 2 civil uprisings, and Saddam Hussein remained in power and continued to threaten peace in the Middle East. August 19th, 1991. It was the start of 3 days of turmoil and the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union and communism. On that Monday, 8 hardline communists attempted to oust vacationing Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev by declaring a state of emergency. Due in the capital the next day, Gorbachev had planned on signing an historic treaty. It would dilute the USSR's power over its individual republics by giving them the independence they were demanding. The junta didn't want that to happen, so they sent the KGB, the Soviet secret police, to surround Gorbachev's Black Sea villa to keep him from returning to Moscow. The coup was made up of key government leaders and was headed by Gorbachev's deputy, Vice President Gennady Yaneyev. He took over as president, telling the public Gorbachev was unable to lead because of failing health.
It is our hope that Mikhail Gorbachev, as soon as he feels better, will take up again his office.
From the beginning, the coup was marked by a series of blunders. On Monday, tanks arrived late in Red Square and were met by angry crowds. By the time the tanks reached the Russian Parliament building, supporters of newly elected Russian President Boris Yeltsin had gathered telling tank crews to leave. Yeltsin climbed on a tank and denounced the plotters and called for a strike.
He told his people to resist what he said was a right-wing coup. The emergency decrees had no legal force on the territory of the Russian Federation.
The junta also failed to capture all the local radio and television stations, leaving conspirators unable to control the airwaves and boast false claims of their takeover. By Wednesday, the coup was crumbling, and Gorbachev was reinstated as president by the Soviet Parliament. Thursday, he returned to Moscow.
I congratulate our Soviet people who showed great dignity and loyalty to the man in whom they entrusted power, and not to that pitiful handful of plotters who had attractive slogans but wanted to push the country into catastrophe.
Ironically, the junta that was formed to solidify the Soviet Union actually hastened its demise. During the 3 days of turmoil, 3 Baltic republics seized the opportunity to claim independence. Several other Soviet republics would soon do the same. Yaneyev and 12 other suspected junta leaders were arrested and charged with treason. The Communist Party was blamed for the trouble, and the party collapsed in a matter of days. On December 25, 1991, the central government transferred power to the republics, and the USSR officially ceased to exist. 11 of the 15 former Soviet republics formed a new association, the Commonwealth of Independent States. 74 years after Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, the Communist Party was dead, the victim of a second Russian Revolution. February 7, 1992 was a day to celebrate. 12 European countries signed the Treaty on European Union. The Maastricht Treaty was designed to integrate Europe into one political and economic superpower. It would reduce trade barriers, creating the world's largest free market made up of 340 million people. To further promote trade, it could create a single currency for all 12 nations by the end of the 90s.
From the viewpoint of people who do believe in the European integration process, that the bottle is more than half full. And this is a victory for Europe and a victory for the integration process.
The path to the treaty began in the 50s when trade and custom unions formed in Western Europe. Their goal, to rebuild economies that were destroyed by World War II. These pacts led 6 nations to form the European Community in 1967. The EC's customs-free common market was so successful, another 6 countries joined by 1986. In 1991, member nations gathered in Maastricht, the Netherlands, to finalize details of the Treaty on European Union. They decided the EC should develop its own defense force, foreign policies, labor agreements, and common currency. Germany's Helmut Kohl called the treaty a decisive breakthrough, and Francis Mitterrand said Europe was embarking on a great adventure.
Could, he said, henceforth regard itself as the greatest world power in trade, in industry, and in research. Maastricht would bring the greatest changes since the Treaty of Rome.
But some countries were hesitant to give up their national currencies. British Prime Minister John Major insisted that Britain retain the option to forego the European common currency. Major also forced the EC to drop a provision giving it the right to govern workers' rights issues in member countries.
I was not prepared to risk Britain's competitive position as the European magnet for inward investment. I was not prepared to put British jobs on the line.
Major's insistence on special treatment for Britain upset some other EC countries that wanted to move forward.
The history of our Europe learns us that even when 1 or 2 member states lag behind a little bit, the final analysis, they'll follow.
European community leaders watched as implementation of the treaty slowed during a recession in 1992 and 93. Denmark and the United Kingdom indicated they probably would not join the single currency system. But in 1994, as the recession was ending in most European countries, interest in unification was revived. Once again, Europe was faced with the challenge of transforming 12 governments and their currencies into one by the end of the century. On April 29, 1992, one of the worst riots in U.S. history began in Los Angeles. That afternoon, a largely white jury acquitted 4 white police officers charged in the beating of black motorist Rodney King a year earlier. The decision appeared racist to many people, black and white, and it touched off rage in ethnic neighborhoods in South Central Los Angeles. It started with a small mob, but when police failed to intervene, thousands of people took the opportunity to steal. Looters grabbed everything from food to major appliances. Some motorists were dragged from cars and beaten. Arson fires were set throughout the city. These shopkeepers armed themselves and fought back. The violence continued until 4,500 National Guard and Marine troops arrived and restored order. Finally, on May 4th, relative calm returned to Los Angeles. The riot lasted 5 days and its toll was staggering. More than 50 people were dead and some 4,000 were injured. 12,500 were arrested in connection with the rioting. Over 600 structures were damaged or destroyed, and losses exceeded $1 billion. Many concluded that growing unrest among impoverished inner-city residents and distrust between minorities and police was the fuel that fed the fires. Sadly, those flames still smolder in the City of Angels. June 16, 1992, was the day the Cold War died. The United States and Russia agreed to the most massive arms cut since the nuclear age began 40 years ago. It was an 11-year plan to scrap 2/3 of all long-range nuclear weapons.
And I am very pleased with the arrangements that we were able to work out with President Yeltsin today. I think it's good for mankind. I think it's good for the generations here and the generations to come. And so you're here on a historic occasion, and we couldn't be more pleased.
The nuclear arms race began in the 50s. By 1992, Russia had accumulated over 10,000 nuclear warheads. The United States had nearly the same number. Now, the nuclear arms buildup was over. U.S. President George Bush and Russian President Boris Yeltsin agreed that by the year 2003, both sides would have cut their nuclear arsenals by 2/3. The agreement came about in part because of Russia's economic chaos. Competing with the U.S. nuclear weapons program was expensive, and Boris Yeltsin needed financial aid from America. Agreeing to nuclear arms reductions was one way to get it.
I find it difficult to understand why so many people were very surprised by these cuts. They were predictable because Russia is now in deep economic crisis. He has to make concessions to convince the Americans to provide some money.
The plan had two stages. By the end of 1999, Russia would slash its stockpile to 3,800 warheads, while the U.S. cut its stockpile to 4,250. The second stage will be complete in 2003, when Russia has 3,000 and the U.S. 3,500. Both sides had to eliminate land-based multiple warhead missiles. The U.S. gave up its MX and Minuteman ICBMs. Russia gave up its SS-18 and SS-24 missiles. The agreement doesn't mean the threat of nuclear holocaust is over. 5 countries have nuclear weapons, another 3 may have them, and 9 others may be developing nuclear weapons or have attempted to do so in the past. With leaders like Saddam Hussein wanting to join the nuclear club, the superpowers will always need some weapons, say analysts.
Real minimum deterrence is levels of something like 500 warheads on both sides. And you can't go much lower than that. You can't disinvent nuclear weapons.
Though these weapons may never completely disappear, when the U.S. and Russia agreed to destroy over 2/3 of their nuclear missiles on June 16, 1992, the whole world breathed a little easier. On September 13, 1993, millions saw the pen stroke and the handshake that shook the world. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO leader Yasser Arafat agreed to end 45 years of bloody fighting between Arabs and Israelis.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
They signed a declaration of principles. The PLO acknowledged Israel's right to exist as a nation. In turn, Israel recognized the PLO as the only representative of the 1.7 million Palestinian people. The accord set forth a 5-year timetable for limited Palestinian self-rule in the Israeli-occupied Arab territories of the Gaza Strip and the town of Jericho in the West Bank. If self-rule is successful, it could lead to the creation of a permanent nation of Palestine.
Let me address the people of Israel and their leaders with whom we are meeting today for the first time. And let me assure them that the difficult decision we reached together was one that required great and exceptional courage.
Ironically, the peace accord resulted in violence. By the end of the year, 5 PLO leaders had been assassinated by Arabs, right-wing Israelis had attacked Arabs, and Arab extremists had killed an Israeli settler. Israel postponed a December 13th deadline to withdraw its troops from the Gaza Strip and Jericho. By December 15th, at least 44 Arabs and 18 Israelis had died. Despite the bloodshed, Prime Minister Rabin and Chairman Arafat are determined to solve their differences through negotiation. Perhaps soon, all of their people will be able to live in peace. It was just before dawn on January 17, 1994, when the earthquake struck Los Angeles, America's second largest city. Lasting about 30 seconds, it measured 6.7 on the Richter scale. Its massive power caused widespread devastation throughout the area. 60,000 homes and buildings were damaged, and broken gas lines caused sporadic fires and explosions that were difficult to fight because water lines were also ruptured.
Where's the swimming pool? Where's the swimming pool?
The massive trembler was centered in the Northridge area of the San Fernando Valley, about 25 miles northwest of downtown LA. The shock wave was felt in Las Vegas, 280 miles away. Throughout the Los Angeles area, firefighters and civilians tried to save what they could. Many people had to leave all their belongings inside buildings too damaged to enter, especially with powerful aftershocks shaking the area every few hours.
Keep them away from this because this building can still come down.
Local television news stations were also affected by the quake.
As you look out your window, it's probably pitch dark right now. Oops, hang on one second. This is a very sharp aftershock that just hit us right now.
As the sun rose over the city, the devastation of the quake became even more apparent. 3 freeways suffered severe damage. Hundreds of thousands of people found themselves without power, water, and telephones for as long as 10 days. American President Bill Clinton called in federal troops to help in the rescue efforts.
I ask the American people to remember the people of Los Angeles County in their thoughts and prayers today. It's going to be a very difficult few weeks for them as they try to come through the immediate dangers, and there are still some immediate dangers there, and then the aftermath.
The human toll of the earthquake was staggering. 7,000 people were injured and 57 died, 16 of them crushed to death when a 3-story apartment building collapsed. Damage estimates ranged from $13 to $20 billion, and insurance claims reached $7.2 billion, making this the costliest earthquake in U.S. history. On June 12, 1994, a double murder took place in Los Angeles that would lead to the arrest of American football legend O.J. Simpson, and one of the most sensational trials in years. On that summer evening, the body of Simpson's second ex-wife, 35-year-old Nicole Brown, was found outside her condominium. Nearby was the body of a friend, 25-year-old Ronald Goldman. Both had been stabbed to death. After 5 days of police investigations, prosecutors were ready to charge Simpson with murder.
The fact that the case has been filed means that we do have sufficient evidence to convict him and prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
But when police came to arrest Simpson at his home, he had disappeared. However, he was spotted on the freeway in a white Ford Bronco driven by a friend. The pair led police on what became a nationally televised slow-speed chase. Several hours later, it ended at Simpson's home, where he was arrested. In court, Simpson stated his innocence.
Wish you enter a plea guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
The former pro football star, Heisman Trophy winner, network television sportscaster, and actor was widely admired. Americans were shocked by Simpson's arrest and the issues surrounding his trial.
I want to see what's going on. You know, it's been so much publicity and et cetera, and you know, it's kind of hard for me to think that he'd get a fair trial, under these circumstances.
I think an issue that is very much on the minds of women is, can battered women get protection in this culture? The justice system doesn't seem to do much for battered women, doesn't seem to protect them.
Even President Bill Clinton had something to say about O.J.
Children were robbed of a mother, families lost loved ones, and a man widely admired in this country is now caught in the web of a terrible tragedy.
The trial attracted the world's press because of its sensational nature. An interracial romance, a millionaire role model with a hidden history of wife abuse, and a violent murder with clues that pointed to Simpson. The trial rapidly became a media circus and a celebrity event. Limited courtroom space led to a lottery for public seating. Simpson's attorneys were dubbed the Dream Team. They maintained the same message throughout the trial, that police had planted evidence and that O.J. had nothing to do with the murders.
He's not guilty.
Prosecutors could find no eyewitnesses or a murder weapon, so they relied heavily on DNA evidence from blood samples. Nicole Brown Simpson's blood was found on socks discovered in O.J. Simpson's bedroom, in his Bronco, and in the driveway leading to his house. The trial lasted for months. ending with a verdict that remains controversial to this day: not guilty. April 19th, 1995. A bomb destroyed the United States Federal Building in Oklahoma City. A homemade truck bomb exploded, rocking the 9-story building, killing 168 and injuring countless more. Hundreds of firefighters, rescue specialists, and doctors worked around the clock in hopes of finding survivors under the tons of rubble. In the first 24 hours, much of the rescue effort was focused on the preschool victims in the building's daycare center. The rescuers began pulling stunned and injured survivors out of the wreckage. But as the hours and days passed, it became less likely anyone still alive would be found.
Our team said they haven't heard anything. Then they have some very sophisticated hearing equipment, and also they've been looking as much as they can. But the building itself, parts of it, is very fragile, and they're having to do it very slowly. They're having to go in and shore up parts of that building so they can get into some areas. So it's a very delicate situation.
The rescue workers came to save the living, but too often brought out the dead. As rescue efforts continued, the people of Oklahoma City gathered in prayer for the victims of the man-made tragedy.
We have been ruthlessly cut off from those we love and cherish. Bless us, O God.
Police officials had very little to go on, other than 2 composite drawings of potential suspects. Just after the manhunt began, law enforcement officials announced that they had a man in custody. Shortly after the bombing, a man had been detained by the Oklahoma Highway Patrol for driving a car without a license plate. While in custody, the authorities noticed a strong resemblance between the man and one of the FBI composite drawings. The suspect, Timothy McVeigh, was held in El Reno prison. McVeigh, a former soldier and Gulf War veteran, was questioned before being arraigned on charges related to the bombing in Oklahoma City. Police found forensic evidence in McVeigh's car that linked him to the bombing.
Most people here are still shocked by evidence that the bombing was apparently the work of American conspirators, an enemy within.
Another man, Terry Nichols, who was a friend of McVeigh's, was also charged as an accomplice to the crime. While searching Nichols' home, police found a stash of weapons and materials they believed could have been used in the building of a bomb. The bombing in Oklahoma City on April 19, 1995, shook all of America. For the first time in history, terrorism had struck the heartland. On November 4th, 1995, in Tel Aviv, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was shot and mortally wounded by a Jewish right-wing extremist. Rabin's murder dealt a serious blow to the ongoing Arab-Israeli peace process, which he had been pushing forward since 1992. At the time of his death, Yitzhak Rabin was 73 years old. During his lifetime, Rabin had seen the birth and rise of the nation of Israel and had played a pivotal role in shaping its destiny. Rabin was born in 1922 in the historic city of Jerusalem. At the age of 19, Rabin joined the Palma, a secret Jewish military unit. In 1948, during Israel's War of Independence against the Arabs, Rabin led a brigade that opened a crucial lifeline through the embattled city of Jerusalem and captured sections of the city. During the 1950s, Rabin served in various positions in the Israeli Defense Force, or IDF. In 1967, as Chief of Staff of the IDF, Rabin led Israel's military to a stunning and decisive victory against the Arabs in the Six-Day War. After the war, Rabin left the military and began a career in government. Over the next almost quarter century, he would hold a variety of high offices, including time spent as Prime Minister during the 1970s and as Defense Minister during the 1980s. During his time as defense minister, Rabin presided over the Israeli military's response to the Intifada. This Palestinian uprising, which erupted in the occupied territories in 1987, shaped Rabin's thinking about the need for peace talks with the Palestinians. In 1992, Rabin became prime minister, campaigning on a promise to intensify peace talks with the Arabs. In September of 1993, after secret talks between Israel and the Palestinians in Oslo, Norway, Prime Minister Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat signed a historic Declaration of Principles in Washington, D.C.
We who have fought against you, the Palestinians, we say to you today, in a loud and a clear voice, enough of blood and tears. Enough!
Perhaps the most memorable moment of the ceremony occurred when Prime Minister Rabin shook hands with Israel's longtime nemesis, Yasser Arafat. This gesture, perhaps more than any other, signified the bold yet controversial path towards peace that Rabin was charting for his country. A year later in Cairo, the peace process took another significant step forward when Rabin and Arafat signed the Oslo Peace Accord. This agreement allowed Palestinians in some parts of the occupied territories self-rule for the first time. Soon after, the momentum for peace in the Middle East continued to build. Prime Minister Rabin and Jordan's King Hussein officially declared an end to the state of war that had existed between their two countries for 46 years.
No more suspicion, no more fear, no more uncertainty.
You and I, Your Majesty, are making peace here, our own peace, the peace of soldiers and the peace of friends.
In 1995, Rabin continued to advance the cause of peace by signing the second Oslo Peace Accord. By this time, Rabin's negotiations with Yasser Arafat, a man that many in Israel considered a terrorist, had generated strong opposition within the country.
Rabin, Peres are not the Jewish people. We are the Jewish people.
On November 4th, 1995, as he left a peace rally in Tel Aviv, Prime Minister Rabin was shot and fatally wounded by Yigal Amir, a Jewish right-wing extremist. In the wake of Rabin's murder, the nation was plunged into mourning. But despite his death, Rabin's legacy would endure. Over time, the peace process that he championed would continue. History will remember Yitzhak Rabin as a great leader, a warrior who had the courage to seek an end to the bloody conflict in the Middle East.
We have to have a policy that gives a peace a chance.
On February 23, 1997, one of the century's greatest scientific achievements was unveiled before the eyes of a stunned world. Her name was Dolly the sheep. Scientists at the Roslin Institute near Edinburgh, Scotland, had created the first successful clone of an adult mammal. Their achievement had profound implications for society.
A Church of Scotland report has called for an independent commission to be set up to examine the ethics of biotechnology.
The announcement of Dolly's existence ignited a firestorm of controversy over cloning's possible uses and abuses. Even the President of the U.S. felt compelled to comment on the implications of this startling breakthrough.
Each human life is unique, born of a miracle that reaches beyond laboratory science. I believe we must respect this profound gift and resist the temptation to replicate ourselves.
Previously, most experts had believed the creation of a clone from an adult mammal was impossible, the stuff of science fiction. Clones had been created before, but they had been engineered from embryo cells, or from the adult cells of plants and non-mammals. Dolly represented a major scientific advance. Researchers had never before successfully used a cell from a fully grown adult mammal to make a genetically identical copy or clone of that mammal. To create Dolly, scientists at the Roslin Institute first extracted a cell from an adult sheep and then grew the cell in the lab for 6 days. The next step was to take an unfertilized egg from a second sheep, remove the DNA from that egg, and combine the egg with the cell from the first sheep. The resulting embryo was then placed in a third sheep. This third sheep gave birth to Dolly, an exact genetic copy or clone of the first sheep. The potential benefits and dangers that could come from producing exact genetic copies of animals, possibly including humans, were staggering. Dr. Ian Wilmot led the research team that created Dolly.
I don't think we can begin to estimate what new understanding this will offer, not only for normal health, but also for human diseases. And I think that our successors undoubtedly will see that that use will be very important.
Cloning technology promises to aid in the creation of medicinal drugs for human use. It also offers the potential to greatly improve the livestock breeding process, as well as to help repopulate endangered species.
Scientists in China are claiming a breakthrough in their attempts to clone the giant panda. A team at Beijing's Institute of Zoology say they've already successfully copied some of the key steps used in the creation last year of Dolly the cloned sheep.
In addition to ongoing experiments, researchers have succeeded since Dolly in cloning other mammals, such as mice and calves. Today, potential problems with cloning adult mammals are being investigated. Recent findings indicate clones like Dolly may have a tendency to age faster than their natural-born counterparts. But as for the long-term consequences of Dolly's creation and of cloning in general, only time will tell. On August 31st, 1997, in Paris, France, a violent car crash cut short the life of one of the most famous and admired women in the world, Diana, the Princess of Wales. Also killed in the accident were her companion, Dodi Al-Fayed, and the car's driver, Henri Paul. Another passenger, security guard Trevor Rees-Jones, was severely injured but survived the crash. Around the world, the tremendous outpouring of grief over Diana's tragic demise was a testament to her unique personal charisma and style. It also demonstrated the public's affection for the royal they called the People's Princess. Diana Frances Spencer was born into an aristocratic English family and as a child had been a playmate of the Queen's sons. After completing school, she worked as a kindergarten teacher. She also re-established her connection with the royals, and in 1980, her relationship with Charles, the Prince of Wales, deepened. On July 29, 1981, before hundreds of millions of television viewers and a distinguished audience at St. Paul's Cathedral, Charles and Diana were married. The epic ceremony had the magical feel of a fairy tale come true.
I, Diana Frances.
Take thee, Charles Philip Arthur George.
Take thee, Philip Charles Arthur George.
Diana, the kindergarten teacher, had now become the Princess of Wales, admired and adored by millions around the globe. During the 1980s, Charles and Diana had two children, Princes William and Harry. In addition to becoming a mother, the woman formerly nicknamed Shy Di now emerged as a dazzling fashion plate, wowing the public with her style and beauty. But beneath the shimmering surface of a charmed and glamorous life, Diana's unhappiness in her marriage grew. Her husband Charles would later confess to engaging in an affair with an old flame, Camilla Parker Bowles, during their marriage. Years later, Diana revealed that the strains in her marriage, the stress of her high-profile public duties, and bad relations with the royal family all caused her at various times to try and inflict injury on herself. The accumulated tension also led her into a bout with the binge and purge eating disorder known as bulimia. By 1992, the royal couple's relationship had deteriorated beyond repair.
It is announced from Buckingham Palace that, with regret, the Prince and Princess of Wales have decided to separate.
Diana would later confess to having her own adulterous affair during their separation. In 1996, after 15 years of marriage, what had initially seemed a fairy tale romance came to a decidedly unhappy ending when Charles and Diana finally divorced. Over the next year, Diana continued to work in support of her favorite causes.
It is doubly difficult to deal with AIDS in a country like Britain, where there is still an understandable reluctance to have frank and open discussions on emotional issues. Having seen for myself the devastation that anti-personnel landmines cause, I am committed to supporting, in whatever way I can, the international campaign to outlaw these dreadful weapons.
But on August 31st, 1997, her luminous life was cut short when driver Henri Paul lost control of the car she was in and slammed into a tunnel pillar at 60 miles per hour. Controversy swirled in the aftermath of the accident. It was discovered that Paul was legally intoxicated and taking prescription medication for depression at the time of the crash. Other observers blamed the accident on the frenzied pack of celebrity photographers known as paparazzi, who had been chasing after Diana's car at the time of the crash. At Diana's memorial service, her brother, Earl Spencer, paid eloquent tribute to her life.
Diana was the very essence of compassion, of duty, of style, of beauty. All over the world, she was a symbol of selfless humanity. A very British girl who transcended nationality. It is a point to remember that of all the ironies about Diana, perhaps the greatest was this: a girl given the name of the ancient goddess of hunting was, in the end, the most hunted person of the modern age.
Whatever the exact truth of the circumstances surrounding her death, it is certain that a genuine affection for Princess Diana lives on in the hearts of millions of people around the world. To them, she will always be the people's princess. December 19th, 1998. The U.S. House of Representatives voted to impeach President Bill Clinton for perjuring himself and obstructing justice as he attempted to conceal his sexual liaison with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. 6 years earlier, Bill Clinton had been elected president on a wave of high hopes. A 5-term governor from Arkansas, this 42nd president swept the Democratic Party back into the White House in 1992. But his policies quickly alienated conservative Republicans in Congress, and their numbers increased in the 1994 election. In the same year, Kenneth Starr was appointed independent counsel to investigate Clinton's involvement with an Arkansas real estate venture called Whitewater. A staunch Republican and right-wing ideologue, Starr had earlier assisted the legal team of Paula Corbin Jones, who filed a case against Clinton for sexual misconduct during his tenure as governor of Arkansas. Hindered by both the Whitewater and Paula Jones investigations, Clinton battled with an increasingly obstinate Congress. Then, in November 1995, he began a clandestine affair with Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old unpaid intern at the White House. After 5 months, Clinton aides arranged for Lewinsky's reassignment to the Pentagon. A year passed, and Paula Jones's legal team called on Lewinsky for questioning. Later, they asked Clinton about his relations with Ms. Lewinsky. He replied evasively, then clarified his statements before a grand jury and the press.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman.
Kenneth Starr believed Clinton lied under oath by making this statement, and he built his case around it. Clinton's lawyers argue that such allegations, even if true, were far from sufficient to impeach a president.
No one wants to get this matter behind us more than I do.
After Lewinsky and Clinton testified extensively before grand juries in the summer of 1998, Clinton issued a statement.
Indeed, I did have a relationship with Miss Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong.
Kenneth Starr submitted a 117,000-word document to Congress, the Starr Report, documenting the couple's sexual activities and paving the way to the Clinton impeachment in December.
Not guilty. Mr. Campbell, guilty.
A majority of the public disapproved of the muckraking hearings, and by February, after a 5-week trial in the Senate, Clinton was acquitted. But his place in history was forever tarnished by an incident of sexual misconduct exploited by his political opponents. The 1990s witnessed incredible change, from the breakup of the Soviet Union to an attempted lasting peace in the Middle East. But resistance to change is often high, and violence continued as nations struggled to create a new world order. No one knows where these changes will take us as we enter the 21st century, but one thing is certain: every year of every decade, our days will be filled with the trials and triumphs that bring the world community together as we face the challenges of a new millennium.